I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. It was a fate I had already been living for a year, a quiet, orderly damnation of velvet draperies and silent hallways. But they spoke as if cementing the final stone on a tomb. My tomb. The one I was expected to gratefully inhabit. "She is a sensible girl," my stepmother Augusta had said, her voice the crisp, confident rustle of banknotes. "Plain, perhaps, but sensible. She understands her duty." I had been standing in the upstairs gallery of my father's London house, ostensibly searching for a misplaced volume of poetry, but truly, I was simply breathing. The air in that house was always thin, rationed out according to one's station, and mine had always been negligible. They were discussing my marriage to the Duke of Blackwood, a man I had met precisely 3 times. It was a transaction, a neat and tidy solution to my father's catastrophic debts and my own inconvenient existence. My beautiful elder sister Rosamond, the one for whom the Duke had originally made his inquiries, had shattered all their plans by eloping with a penniless cavalry officer 2 months prior. I was the spare part, the less polished but functional replacement, the sensible one. The word was a condemnation, a dismissal of any possibility for passion or joy or even simple, vibrant life. It meant I would not make a fuss. It meant I would be grateful. And for a year, I had been. I had performed my duties as his Duchess with the quiet efficiency of a well-made clock, ticking away the days in his vast, cold, ancestral home, a place that felt more like a museum to his first wife than a home for his second. Alistair, the Duke, was a man carved from the same granite as his forbidding castle. He was severe and remote, his grief for his first wife, Isabel, a palpable presence that clung to him like the damp chill of the estate's stone walls. He was polite, he was correct, he never raised his voice, and he never offered a word more than was strictly necessary. We took our meals together in a dining room so long that our voices were lost in the echoing space between us. He would inquire after my day, and I would offer a brief, edited summary that omitted the crushing loneliness and the hours spent wandering the gardens, feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life. He would nod, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, and then the silence would descend again, broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. I did not know the man I was married to. I knew only the shape of his obligations and the profound, unbreachable wall of his sorrow. The catalyst for change, the stone tossed into the stagnant pool of my existence, arrived in a lacquered black carriage on a Tuesday. Lady Beatrice Finch, a cousin of the late Duchess Isabel, and the woman society had long believed Alistair would marry after a suitable period of mourning, had come for an extended visit. She was everything I was not. Vibrant and confident, with a laugh that echoed in the silent halls, and a beauty that seemed to rebuke the sombre decor. She moved through Blackwood Manor not as a guest, but as one returning home, her hands brushing over familiar objects, her conversation with Alistair littered with shared memories that excluded me as surely as a locked door. I watched them from the periphery, my supposed domain. I saw the way his severe expression softened almost imperceptibly when she spoke of their shared past, of summers spent together before his first marriage, before the tragedy that had taken Isabel. I saw the easy familiarity in her touch as she laid a hand on his arm, a gesture of casual intimacy that felt like a physical blow to me. The servants, who had always treated me with a distant, correct respect, seemed to thaw in her presence, their smiles genuine, their service infused with a warmth I had never known. I was the Duchess, but she was the heart of the house. I was an imposter, a placeholder, and her arrival was the final, irrefutable proof. My only sanctuary was the library. It was a magnificent 2-story room, smelling of leather and beeswax and old paper, a scent I found more comforting than any perfume. It was the one place at Blackwood that did not seem to hold the ghost of Isabel. It was a room of ideas, of history, of worlds beyond the suffocating confines of my own. I spent my days there, lost in books on botany and agricultural theory, finding a strange solace in the structured logic of crop rotation and soil composition. It was a language of practicality, of making things grow, a stark contrast to the sterile, fruitless reality of my life. It was there that the first crack appeared in the wall between my husband and me. I was curled in a worn leather armchair near the fire, a heavy volume on drainage techniques for clay soil open on my lap, my brow furrowed in concentration. I was so engrossed that I did not hear him enter. I only became aware of his presence when a shadow fell over my page. I looked up, my heart lurching with the startled panic of a discovered trespasser. The Duke stood before me, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on my face, but on the book in my hands. "Mr. Henderson's treatise," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. "A dense read for a lady." It was not a compliment, nor was it precisely a criticism. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a faint note of surprise. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck, a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, unbidden defiance. "I find it more compelling than the latest sentimental novel, Your Grace," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "It seems a more useful application of one's time to understand how to feed a population than to read of the imaginary sorrows of fictional heroines." For the first time since my arrival at Blackwood, he truly looked at me. It was not the polite, vacant sweep of the eyes one gives a piece of furniture, nor the dutiful glance of a husband across a dinner table. It was a direct, focused gaze, sharp and analytical, as if he were seeing me for the first time. He saw not the plain, sensible girl his contract had purchased, but a woman reading a book on agricultural science in the heart of his home. His dark eyes, which I had always thought were merely cold, held a flicker of something I could not name. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a light, a sudden startling illumination. A long moment passed, stretched taut between us. "Indeed," he said at last, the single word carrying an unexpected weight. He did not say more. He simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and turned, leaving the library as silently as he had entered. But the room had changed. The air was different, charged with the residue of that look. I sat for a long time, the book forgotten in my lap, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. A key had turned in a lock I had not even known was there. He had seen me. For one brief, shattering moment, he had actually seen me. After that day in the library, a subtle shift occurred in the tectonic plates of our lives. It was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, almost imperceptible drift. He began to seek me out.
Not in the drawing-room, where Lady Beatrice held court with her sparkling anecdotes and effortless charm, but in the quiet, book-lined sanctuary that had become my own.
He would appear in the late afternoon, a silent presence at first, selecting a book from a high shelf. Then he started to speak. He would ask what I was reading, and our conversations, initially stilted and academic, began to flow. We spoke of drainage and crop yields, of the new enclosure acts and the plight of his tenant farmers. I discovered he was not merely a duke by title, he was a master of his domain, his knowledge of his lands profound, and his desire for their improvement a quiet, burning passion. He spoke of his plans, his frustrations with outdated methods, and his hopes for a more prosperous future for the people who depended on him. And he listened. When I offered a tentative suggestion, gleaned from my reading, about the use of lime to sweeten the acidic soil in the north pasture, he did not dismiss it. He considered it, his brow furrowed in that same intense concentration I had first seen in his gaze. "My bailiff has been arguing for it," he admitted one evening, as the shadows grew long and the fire cast dancing patterns on the ceiling. "But he could not articulate the principle as clearly as you just have." He looked at me again, with that same unnerving focus. "Where did you learn this, Elara?" He had used my name, not Duchess, not the formal you, but my name. It fell into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond, the ripples spreading through me in a warm, shocking wave. It was the most intimate thing he had ever said to me. "I read it, Alistair," I replied, testing his name on my tongue for the first time. It felt both foreign and deeply familiar. "In a pamphlet published by the Agricultural Society. I can show it to you." We spent the next hour with our heads bent over the pamphlet, a wavering partition of gold from the lamp falling over us, our shoulders nearly touching. In that moment, surrounded by the silent, sleeping books, we were not a duke and his duchess. We were two minds, met in a field of common interest. The small kindnesses began then, so subtle they were almost invisible. I had mentioned once, in passing, that my private sitting room was draughty. A few days later, I returned to find a heavy velvet portière had been hung over the door, and the window sashes had been resealed with new felt. No one said a word about it. When I expressed an admiration for the delicate botanical illustrations in a particular book, a slim, leather-bound portfolio of original prints by the same artist appeared on my writing desk the next morning, with no card, no explanation. I knew it was him. These were not grand gestures, they were quiet acts of observation. He was paying attention. He was noticing the small details of my comfort, my interests, my existence. And each quiet act was another thread, weaving a delicate, tentative connection between us. Lady Beatrice observed this shift with a sharp, calculating eye. Her smiles toward me became brittle, her pleasantries edged with a fine, sharp steel. She would interrupt our conversations in the library with a bright, trilling laugh, a hand possessively on Alistair's arm, steering him away with a reminder of some shared memory, some inside joke. "Oh, Alistair, do leave the Duchess to her dusty books. You must come and settle a debate Charles and I were having about the Hunter trials last autumn. You remember, the day my mare took the water jump so beautifully." She wielded their shared past like a weapon, a constant reminder of my outsider status. But something had changed in Alistair. He would go with her,
his sense of duty to a guest unbending, but his backward glance at me held a new, apologetic quality. The wall between us was eroding, stone by silent stone, and I began to hope. I began to imagine a future that was not a silent damnation, but a quiet partnership. A life built not on passion, perhaps, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect and shared intellectual ground. It was a modest hope, but it was more than I had ever allowed myself to possess. The hope was a fragile, budding thing, and it was shattered on a cold, moonless night. I had been unable to sleep, my mind turning over a passage I had read about the merino sheep Alistair hoped to introduce to the estate. I went to the library, thinking to find the book again, but as I passed a long gallery window, I saw a figure moving across the lawn below. It was Alistair, a dark cloak wrapped around him, his stride long and purposeful. He was not heading toward the stables, but toward the dower house, a small, elegant manor at the edge of the woods where Lady Beatrice had been installed. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, coiled in my stomach. I watched until his figure was swallowed by the darkness surrounding the distant house. An hour passed. Then, too, I remained at the window, a frozen sentinel, the cold from the glass seeping into my bones. Just before dawn, I saw him return, his silhouette a weary slash against the pale grey light. It was not the first time. I realised, with a sudden, devastating clarity, that his late nights in his study, the ones I had attributed to the endless burden of estate paperwork, were a lie. The next day, the whispers of the staff, which I had always trained myself to ignore, became impossible to shut out. 2 housemaids, polishing silver in a nearby alcove, fell silent as I passed, but I caught the tail end of their conversation.
"Every night, nearly. Just like with the first one. You always did have a soft spot for the Finch ladies."
The words were a poisoned dart, finding their mark with brutal accuracy. The first one, Isabel. And now, Beatrice. It was a pattern, a history, and I was merely an interruption. That afternoon, sorting through some of Isabel's things that were still stored in a cedar chest in my dressing room, a task I had been putting off, I found it. A small lacquered box tied with a faded ribbon. Inside was a stack of letters, written in Beatrice's elegant, sloping hand, to Alistair, dated from the year before our marriage. They were filled with intimate condolences for his loss, but woven through them were shared memories, inside jokes, and a tone of possessive, confident affection. One sentence leaped from the page, burning itself into my mind. "You know, my dearest Alistair, that my heart is and always will be yours to command. You need only ask." The air left my lungs. The kindnesses, the conversations, the shared looks, it all reassembled itself in my mind into a new, hideous mosaic. I was a convenience, a respectable Duchess to manage his house and provide a future heir, while his heart remained entangled with another. His attention to me was not a budding affection. It was a strategy, a way to ensure his placid, sensible wife remained placid and sensible, so he could continue his true life in the shadows. The key I had felt turning in the lock had not been opening a door to a shared future. It had been locking me more securely into my gilded cage. The cold returned, more profound and absolute than ever before, because this time it was not merely the absence of warmth, it was the chilling presence of a hope that had been deliberately, cruelly extinguished. I retreated. The wall I built around myself was higher and more impenetrable than any Alistair had ever erected. I became the Duchess I was always meant to be, a perfect, bloodless automaton. I managed the household with flawless efficiency. I presided over the dinner table with a cool, distant grace. I answered his inquiries about my day with polite, meaningless monosyllables. When he tried to draw me into a conversation in the library, I would make an excuse and leave. The books that had once been my sanctuary now feeling like hollow props in a well-staged play. I could not bear to be in that room with him, the ghost of our nascent connection mocking me from every shelf. He noticed the change immediately. His brow would furrow in confusion when I evaded his eyes. I saw a flicker of hurt in his expression, which I ruthlessly dismissed as a frustration that his carefully managed plan was going awry. He began to look weary, the lines around his eyes deepening. The small, tentative light I had seen in him was extinguished, and the severe, remote Duke returned, more guarded than ever before. A chasm of frozen silence opened between us, wider and more desolate than the one that had existed before. At least then there had been ignorance. Now there was the sharp, bitter pain of betrayal. Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, blossomed in the renewed frost. She was constantly at his side, her voice a soothing murmur, her presence a constant, vibrant reproach to my own colourless state. She looked at me with an expression of pity that was more insulting than any open scorn. She was winning. She had always been winning. I had simply been too foolish to see it. This state of Cold War continued for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of agonizingly long dinners, of corridors where we passed like ships in the night, of a shared bed that felt as vast and empty as a polar ice cap. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and more transparent with each passing day. The sensible girl was being erased. The confrontation came, as I knew it must. He cornered me one evening in the long gallery, the portraits of his ancestors looking down on us with stony indifference. The sun had set, and the room was filled with a deep, bruised twilight that rendered his face a mask of shadows. "I will not endure this any longer, Ilara," he said, his voice low and strained, stripped of all its usual formal control. "What have I done?" I summoned what little strength I had left, wrapping my dignity around me like a threadbare cloak. "You have done nothing, Your Grace," I said, my voice as brittle as ice. "You have behaved with perfect propriety, as have I." "Propriety?" He took a step closer, and for the first time I saw not coldness in his eyes, but a raw, desperate frustration. "Is that what you call this frozen hell we are living in? A week ago we were talking, we were connecting. Now you look through me as if I am made of glass. I will have an answer. I deserve that much." A bitter, humourless laugh escaped my lips. "Deserve? What is it you think you deserve, Your Grace? A wife who is both dutiful and blind? I am afraid I can only manage the former." His face hardened. "You will explain yourself. I will not be dismissed with riddles." The injustice of it all,
The sheer audacity of his demand broke through my carefully constructed composure. "You want an explanation?" I said, my voice shaking with a fury I had not known I possessed. "Very well, you may have one. Your late-night visits to the Dower House have become a subject of great interest to your staff, and, I must confess, to me. I had not realized your duties as a host extended to such hours. I expected denial. I expected anger. I expected a cold, ducal dismissal of my accusations. Instead, an expression of profound, bone-deep weariness settled over his features. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were filled with a pain so stark it silenced the angry retort on my lips. "The Dower House," he repeated, his voice flat. He did not look at me, but stared past me at the darkening windows. "You believe I am having an affair with Beatrice." It was not a question. It was a statement of dreadful fact. He finally understood the source of my coldness, and the knowledge seemed to hollow him out. "It is the most logical conclusion," I whispered, my anger deflating into a miserable ache. "Logical," he mused, a bitter twist to his lips. "No, it is the most obvious conclusion perhaps, but it is not the correct one." He turned his gaze back to me, and it was clear, direct, and utterly devoid of deception. "Lady Beatrice is not my mistress, Ilara. She never has been. I go to the Dower House to sit with Isabel's mother. Lady Ashworth has been an invalid for 5 years, paralysed and unable to speak. She lives there, in secret, because she is a proud woman who would rather die than have the world know of her infirmity. Beatrice helps the nurse care for her. That is all." The world tilted on its axis. The pieces of my carefully constructed narrative of betrayal crumbled into dust, leaving only a gaping void of my own making. An invalid mother, a secret kept out of kindness and respect for a woman's pride. It was so simple, so honourable, so... Alistair. "Why?" I managed to ask, the word a faint breath. "Why did you not tell me?" "It was not my secret to tell," he said simply. "It was Lady Ashworth's. I gave her my word years ago. I did not anticipate it would ever be a cause for concern to my wife." The unspoken words hung in the air between us. The wife who was a stranger. The wife who was a duty. He had not thought to share his burdens with me because he had never considered me a partner in his life. The pain of that was a different sort, a dull ache of exclusion rather than the sharp sting of betrayal, but it was pain nonetheless. "The letters," that I said, feeling the need to confess my own trespass. "I found letters from Beatrice to you before our marriage." He sighed, a long, ragged sound. "Beatrice has always possessed a romantic imagination. She mistook a shared childhood and my grief for something more. I was, I admit, too lost in my own misery to correct her as forcefully as I should have. That was my failing. But my heart, Ilara, was not involved. It was not capable of being involved. It was broken." He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands clenched at his sides. "Everything you have imagined is a ghost story, a fiction. The only truth is that for the past 2 weeks, this house has been colder than it ever was in the depths of my mourning. Because you were no longer in it,
You were here, but you were gone." The vulnerable confession hung in the air, raw and astonishing. He was not defending his actions, he was explaining his heart. He was telling me that my presence, my warmth, had mattered,
that my absence had left a void. In the face of his stark honesty, my own foolish, prideful silence seemed a terrible crime. I had judged him on whispers and assumptions, building a fortress of resentment around a misunderstanding. I had seen a man sneaking home to a mistress, when in fact it was a man dutifully tending to the last, painful remnants of his past. I had allowed Beatrice's narrative to become my own, and in doing so, I had pushed away the one person who had begun to see me for who I truly was. Before I could find the words to respond, to apologize, to explain, Lady Beatrice herself appeared at the far end of the gallery, a silken shawl draped over her arms.
"Alistair, there you are," she began, her voice bright and musical. But it faltered as she took in the scene before her, the palpable tension between us. Her eyes narrowed, her smile tightening at the corners. She saw, with an instinct honed by years of social manoeuvring, that she was losing ground.
She glided toward us, her expression shifting to one of sweet concern. "Oh, my dears, you both look so dreadfully serious. I do hope the Duchess is not overwhelming you with more of her agricultural concerns, Alistair. You have looked so tired of late." She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of familiar ownership. It was then that Alistair did something that changed everything. He subtly, but deliberately, stepped away from her touch, moving a half step closer to me. It was a small movement, but in the charged atmosphere of the gallery, it was a seismic declaration. He was choosing his ground. He was standing with me. "Ilara and I were discussing a private matter, Beatrice," he said, his voice quiet, but laced with a new, unmistakable authority. It was the voice of the Duke, but it was also the voice of a husband protecting his wife. Beatrice's mask of pleasantry slipped. A flash of pure, venomous resentment showed in her eyes. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But you must not allow the burdens of the estate to consume you entirely. We must remember to honour the past as well. I was just telling Mrs. Gable how much Isabel adored the winter roses. I thought it would be a lovely tribute to have them placed on the dining table tomorrow night for the dinner party. A way to keep her memory alive in this house." It was a masterful stroke, a public attempt to relegate me to the status of a temporary caretaker in Isabel's home. She was reminding him and me of his first love, his great loss, and my secondary place in his life and history. The old Ilara would have retreated, would have murmured a quiet assent, and endured the sting of the insult in silence. But I was not the old Ilara. Something in Alistair's confession, in his quiet defence of me, had forged a new strength in my spine. I met Beatrice's gaze directly, my own calm and steady. "That is a thoughtful sentiment, Lady Beatrice," I said, my voice clear and carrying in the quiet hall. "But the winter roses this year have been blighted, a pity. Instead, I have asked the gardener to prepare arrangements of hellebore and snowdrops. They are far more resilient in the cold, a symbol of new growth, you see. This house has been in mourning long enough. It is time for a new season." The silence that followed was absolute. I had not only countered her move, I had claimed my territory. I was the Duchess of Blackwood, and I was no longer content to live in the shadow of my predecessor. I was planting my own garden. Alistair looked at me, and in his eyes I saw an astonishment that quickly morphed into a profound, undisguised admiration. A slow smile touched his lips, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his severe face, making him look younger, less burdened. It was the first time I had ever seen him truly smile. "An excellent decision, my dear," he said, his voice warm. He then turned to Beatrice, his expression once again cool and ducal. "I believe you have overstayed your welcome, Beatrice. I will have my man arrange for your carriage to be ready in the morning." The public vindication was swift and total. Beatrice's face, for a moment, was a mask of disbelief and fury. She had played her final card and lost the entire game. Without another word, she turned on her heel and swept from the gallery, her departing fury a palpable wave in the air she left behind. Her social, emotional, and moral defeat was absolute. We were left alone in the twilight, the ancestral portraits our silent witnesses. The great clock in the hall chimed the hour, each stroke marking the end of the old era and the beginning of something new and terrifyingly uncertain. Alistair turned to me, his expression earnest and open. "Ilara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. I have been a fool. A blind, grieving fool. I married you out of duty, and I treated you as a duty. I did not see the intelligent, strong, and deeply kind woman who was standing beside me all along. You have brought order to my house, insight to my work, and you have made me feel as if the sun might rise again. I did not know what a home was until I heard you arguing with my bailiff about soil acidity in my own library. Forgive me." His vulnerable confession, his powerful, unadorned words washed away the last of my resentment. He was not the cold, remote man I had believed him to be, but a man who had been lost in a long winter and was finally, tentatively, turning his face toward the spring. And I, who had also been living in a season of cold, felt a corresponding thaw within my own heart. "There is nothing to forgive, Alistair," I whispered. "We were both strangers, bound by a contract. Perhaps it is time we wrote a new one." He stepped closer, closing the final space between us. He gently took my hand, his thumb stroking the back of my palm. The simple touch was electric, a current of warmth and promise. "I should like that very much," he said, his voice low. He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to my knuckles. He did not release my hand, but held it, weaving his fingers through mine. "Ilara, Duchess of Blackwood," he murmured, testing the words on his tongue. "My wife." He looked into my eyes, and I saw in their depths not just admiration, but a dawning, wondrous affection. He lowered his head, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I did not. I stood my ground, my heart thundering in my chest, and met him halfway. The final kiss was not a kiss of passion, not yet. It was something far more profound. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was tender and deep, and shaking with the relief of a long-held tension finally released. It was the sealing of a new treaty, a promise of a shared future. A quiet acknowledgement that two lonely, sensible people had, against all odds, found their way to each other in the echoing halls of a cold, grey castle. In his arms, I was not the plain replacement, not the dutiful Duchess. I was Ilara, and I was finally, truly, seen. 3 months later, the winter roses bloomed, their petals a defiant crimson against the lingering snow. Alistair and I stood looking at them from the library window, his arm warm and solid around my shoulders. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of planning, of debate, of the occasional shared, quiet laugh that still felt like a miracle every time it happened. We were partners in every sense of the word. Our days spent poring over maps and ledgers. Our evenings spent reading aloud by the fire. He had shown me every corner of his estate, and I had shown him every corner of my mind. My family, upon hearing of Lady Beatrice's abrupt departure, had written letters of concerned inquiry. Alistair had answered them with a cool, brief note that made it clear that his wife's position was unassailable and their interference was unwelcome. The final payment for my father's debts was made, and the transaction that had begun my life at Blackwood was officially concluded. But it was no longer a transaction. It was my life. Mrs. Gable, the formidable housekeeper, now smiled whenever she saw us together, a genuine, approving smile that warmed me more than any fire. She had taken to bringing us tea in the library herself, a small but significant sign that she, too, had accepted the changing of the seasons in the great house. That afternoon, Alistair placed a small, crudely carved wooden horse in my hand. "I found this in a trunk in the attic," he said softly. "I made it when I was a boy. It's not very grand." It was simple, worn smooth with time, but it was a piece of his history, freely given. It was a treasure. I closed my fingers around it, its solid shape a comfort in my palm. I looked from the toy to my husband's face, a face I now knew as well as my own, and I saw our future there. It would not be a life of grand passions or dramatic declarations, but one of quiet strength, shared purpose, and deep, abiding respect. A love built not on a foundation of sand, but carved from the same solid, resilient granite as Blackwood itself. I had come to this place a bargain, a sensible solution to a family problem. I had been invisible, a ghost in my own home. But a single look, a shared book, and a man who was willing to see past the surface had changed everything. I had been found. I had come home.